In this week's video, I'm going to show you how we painted up this Chaos Possessed Marine from the Black Legion. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Here we go. To start off with, the model is primed in black, and then what we're going to do is with Games Workshop Evil Sunz Scarlet, we're going to cover up all of the flesh parts. Now we do this with an airbrush, but you can do it with a brush. If you do it with a paintbrush, it's actually going to be a little bit less work because later on we're going to have to cover up all of the armor panels. But we are also thinking about how we do this as a batch, if we're doing an entire army or if we're doing 10 or 20 possessed. So for us, it's going to be easier and more efficient to do it with an airbrush. But again, paintbrush is perfectly fine. You're looking to cover all of the fleshy parts. You can see that we're kind of doing the red from below. It's not necessarily important because a lot of the flesh is going to be covered up anyway. But the idea with this is we're going to put like a little bit of an underlight to the flesh. So the flesh will have a little bit more of a red tint towards the underneath. Again, you don't have to worry about that too much. If you just paint all of the flesh red, it'll be absolutely fine. Now, one of the drawbacks of using the airbrush is the airbrush gives very, very thin coats, and it can be quite hard to get all the way up to opacity with the red. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in with a brush anyway, and all of those recesses of the flesh, what we're going to do is we're going to go in with a brush with a really watered down version of the Evil Sunz Scarlet, and we're going to paint that into the recesses to make sure that we get good coverage. Now we have covered the armor in black again. Don't worry about that. It's just the reason why we do it is it gives us a good idea of what the actual red looks like, because when you airbrush over everything, it can look a little bit messy and it can be hard to judge what you're actually looking at. So this is just a good tip in general when it comes to painting. It's not so important when you're doing a big batch of models, but when you're doing individual models like display pieces, sometimes it's worth just base coating areas around what you're painting to get a true indication of what you're looking at. Anyway, this next step, what we're doing is we're layering on deep purple onto the shadows and midtones of all the flesh. And you can apply this in like a really, really sketchy manner with lots of brush strokes. And the idea with this is we want to create some texture because we're going to smooth it out later. And this is AK Interactive Deep Purple. Don't worry too much about, again, being smooth. Like when we're painting this flesh, one of the big benefits is later on when we put contrast paints over the top and washes, that will smooth out a lot of the work for you. So you can really have some fun with this and just slap it on. Forgive my hair. We're going to layer on a little bit of a mix of Vallejo model color blue green with a little bit of Games Workshop slaanesh grey into the highlight and the mid-tone areas. Now, to be fair, that's not my hair. That is Lucas's. I am not that blonde. So I apologize, but I can assure you we're going to get him a headband. Regardless, this part is where we're really shifting the hues and the color on this skin to make it really, really interesting. But the idea is we're going from red in the darkest areas all the way through to that pinky purple, and then all the way we're shifting to blue. Now, because this is basically very, very rough and very painterly, what we want to do is we want to smooth that out. Now you can do this with a brush if you glaze over with the next step, but basically what we're going to do is you can glaze with a slaanesh grey from Games Workshop, or in our case, because again we're looking for efficiency, we're doing it with the airbrush. And basically what we're going to do is we're building up layers of slaanesh grey over the top of all of this to bring it all together and to smooth it out. And what's going to end up happening, you don't see it too well in the video, but by the time we go over this from above with the slaanesh grey, the colours that we've placed on underneath now tint that slaanesh grey and gives it lots of visual interest. So you don't just have boring flesh tones in the skin, we have something far more interesting and far more exciting. And I've talked about this a lot in previous videos. What you need to remember is when you're painting your army or when you're painting your units, like you really want to focus on the important parts of the model, the dominant parts of the model. And the traditional way we do this is heads, weapons, and, well, armor as a general rule, or heads, weapons, and whatever the other thing is. So it depends on what's dominant. So in this case, what I'm talking about here is for the possessed, it's all about the skin. The armor is just going to be black. Yes, it's going to be bright and it needs to look good. But the reality is what makes these models stand out is the actual skin itself. So this is what we spend the most time on. And then we can spend enough time on everything else to make it pop. If it had like really cool weapons, then we'd focus on like swords and blades and guns and that sort of stuff. But we don't have that on this. It's the same as the head, like we'll spend some time on the head and we'll spend enough time to get it popping, but that head is never going to overpower this skin. So the point of this stage, as I said, is we're kind of just bringing all of this together with the slaanesh grey. This is also why I said earlier about you don't need to paint those armor panels black like we have, because after this airbrush stage, we're going to have to repaint them anyway. When it comes to painting the flames on the back of the backpack, this is relatively simple. So we're going to do a quick wet blend between Vallejo model color blue green and Games Workshop wraithbone. What you're going to do is you're going to try and create a rough gradient. Apologies. Once again, Lucas's head is in the way. I'm going to get a counter at this point in the corner. But as you can see, the blue green is being laid down, and then we're doing that nice rough wet blend so it blends into the skull. This is just a really, really quick way of working, especially on something like flames, because at the end of the day, like by the time you place in the recess wash, a lot of the messier transitions are going to be hidden. Once you've got the wet blend down and you've got that rough transition, do a mix of 2 parts wraithbone and 1 part blue green. Apply this to the recesses of the flame. Don't apply it to the bottom of the flames, just to the recesses. And then if you want to, you can do a rough dry brush of 3 parts, roughly 3 parts blue green and 1 part AK Teneborous Grey to the tips of the flames to make them a little bit darker. Next up, the horns. The horns are really important on the head because obviously the head is one of the focal points. So for the horns, we're going to create another wet blend. We're going to be working from AK Teneborous Grey to Games Workshop Daemonette Hide, all the way up to Games Workshop Screaming Skull. And we're going to repeat this where necessary to build up a nice opaque layer. And if you want, you can come back in with like dilute Screaming Skull, Games Workshop Screaming Skull, to push the value in the areas if you want. So if you want to push the horns a little bit brighter, especially around like closer towards the actual helmet itself, you can absolutely do that. But as long as it looks good from far away, because what's going to happen afterwards is basically we're going to bring it together with contrast paints again. And you can see up close how the wet blend kind of comes together. It's not the perfect transition. It's not the perfect blend. It doesn't need to be, but you can see how it gets brighter towards the head. And the idea with this is if the horns are darker further away from the head and brighter towards the actual helmet itself, what that's going to do is it draws your focus into the head and it makes you look there. So this is helping to reinforce this idea that the face is the focal point and forcing people to look where we want them to look. The armor itself, we're going to keep really simple. So it's base coated in a black of your choice. What you're going to do then is with AK Teneborous Grey and a little bit of Lilac, because we want a little bit of warmth to it. So roughly 2 parts Teneborous Grey and 1 part AK Lilac. Dilute it to a layer consistency, and basically what we're going to do is we're going to stab and jab this armor with a makeup brush, or rather with a dry brush officially. But for what it's worth, you don't need expensive dry brushes. I personally, or rather we personally, just go to like makeup shops and buy cheap makeup brushes, and it does exactly the same thing. You don't need expensive dry brushes. If you want to use them, great, go for it. They're not required. But the idea with this is we're just trying to create some volumetric highlights to make the armor look interesting. Now, you might want to make the armor really bright and shiny, and that makes sense. But for us, we want to keep the armor quite muted, because what that's going to do is if we keep the armor quite muted and dark, it's going to frame up all of that skin a lot better, which is going to make it look a lot more interesting. The metallics are quite simple. We're going to go over all of the trim, which is really time consuming and really boring. It's the worst part about Chaos. But we're going to go over all the trim with a mix of Necro Gold from scale 75 and a little bit of Lilac. So this is probably 3 parts Necro Gold, 1 part Lilac. The main reason for this is basically it's going to desaturate the gold and make it a little bit more matte. This is just going to make our highlights pop more, because that's one of the issues when it comes to painting metallics. Because it's obviously all metallic and it's all shiny, your highlights can get lost quite easily. So if we desaturate it a little bit, make it a little bit more matte, then those highlights are actually going to pop. That's the idea anyway. And this is what it looks like so far. Next stage, we're going to bring it all together with some washes and contrast paints. But before that, if you are enjoying the video, please make sure you hit the like button. It means a huge amount to us and makes a massive difference to the growth of the channel. If you do want to support further, please feel free to check out the members area or the Patreon, or even get in touch if you're interested in getting an army painted by us. Now, to bring all the skin together, what we're going to use is several contrast paints. So We've got Guilliman's Flesh, Aethermatic Blue, Magos Purple, and Volupus Pink. All of these are going to be thinned and controlled with contrast medium, and we're going really quite thin with them. We started off with the Aethermatic Blue, applying it to the mid-tones and wet blending it into the shadows with the Magos Purple. The idea with this is we want the brighter areas or the highlight areas to be a little bit colder in comparison to the Magos Purple in the recesses. But ultimately, what you decide to do with these colours is entirely up to you, but what you need to remember is all of them are going to shift the hue of your painting, so the skin is going to change colour depending on where and what you put on it, and all of these contrast paints are also going to blend out all of that work that you did earlier. So when we said about brush marks are not a problem, we don't need to have smoothness, we can work with like quite rough painting and have some fun with it. This is the time where this all gets fixed and brought together. And also, Chaos Marines, as much as I love Chaos, can be really, really frustrating to paint just because of the stupid amount of trim on it. So doing something like this, having a process like this for all of those little details across your army is actually quite a lot of fun and really, really quite chill. As for the gold, I'm using the contrast Aethermatic Blue. This gives it a nice cold, interesting tone, especially around the darks. Apologies, it will be back into focus in a second, but this is really straightforward. We're just going over all of the gold with this Aethermatic Blue. It gives it some really nice interest. As for the black and the silver, I used a mix of Ratling Grime and Black Templar to go over all of it, just to give it a little bit of depth. And again, to smooth out those brush marks we created when we used the makeup brushes. Now to finish up the metallics, to highlight the golds, we used a mix of Necro Gold from scale 75 and Citrine Alchemy from scale 75 to push our first highlight. This is mainly focusing on the bright areas and any edge highlights that might be relevant. And lastly, for the silver, we mixed a little bit of Vallejo Model Color Steel and AK Silver, and we just placed in the edge highlights. This gives us nice readability to the metal and frames everything quite clearly. Last step, bit of Games Workshop Blood for the Blood God. What we're going to do is we're going to place that in the joints between all of the limbs. This gives us a really nice, well, dark in comparison to everything else, but also quite glossy, grim little result. And once again, separates all of those parts of the body. So remember, readability is the #1 priority when it comes to miniature painting. And that's the point of this. You can see how it separates those limbs really, really nicely. And that's it. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Hoping you find it helpful. As always, comments, queries, feedback, leave them in the comments below. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more, and check out the members area if you want to support the channel even more. As I said previously, we are available for commissions at the moment, so if you want a one-off centerpiece done, or if you want an entire army, get in touch, we can make it happen. Cheers.